Namaste. Our grandchildren, who are 3.5 and 5.5, are a little fascinated with seeds, especially seeds that are found in food that we eat. Like they were asking me why peas come in a pod, and we had something that I must have used, like a stir-fry vegetable mix, and then the pod opened, and they were surprised. There's peas in here, you know? Who hid the peas in the pod? And I was explaining that that's what that looks like, and then if you take the pea and you let it dry, and you put it in the ground and water it, and it becomes a pea plant. And they looked at me like I had just offered to sell them oceanfront property in Nebraska. You know? Like, yeah, right, you know. And in some ways, that's what religious traditions are like. There's something that happens, most often a great teacher, who plants a seed, and then over time, that seed grows and changes and gets transformed, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, sometimes, most of the time, somewhere in the middle, in all honesty. And one of the things that we talked about last week was this idea that isn't mine, but that I stole, that says that if you look at the three categories of books in the Old Testament from a Hebrew perspective, you have a pretty decent model of spiritual growth. And so you start with the law, which are those first 5 books, which give you rules. And so you start out living by rules. And that's not unique to Judaism at all. And then after a while you live by the rules and you grow a little bit and you get into the section of books in the Hebrew Bible known as the prophets. And that happens when you look at the world around you and life around you and you realize both that the rules don't quite explain everything, that the rules aren't always followed, things don't often or always work out according to the way they're supposed to according to the rules, and that some people pay no attention to the rules at all. And so in the Hebrew tradition, there arose this tradition of prophets and prophetic voice who said, wait a minute, this isn't right, this isn't the way it's supposed to go. And that a brief example of that was that first reading we had from Amos, or Micah. Yeah, Micah. I almost used Amos, but it's Micah. And I couldn't decide if I wanted justice to roll down like waters in Amos, or if I wanted what was the traditional version of do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And of course, prophets aren't very popular. And not only were they not very popular when they lived, they still aren't very popular today because it's not too often you see somebody preaching a sermon on one of the prophetic books. We've seen Christianity become pasteurized for our protection, sanitized. One might even go so far as to say castrated. And what happens then is you don't develop to that third level, which is wisdom. The wisdom books are Psalms, Proverbs, not ironically, the Book of Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus, the books in the Bible that seem to, and Ecclesiastes, seem to reflect someone who's sort of lived a long life, taken in what's going on, integrated it with their spiritual journey, and now has something to offer. And in our country, we see how we've lost that because we've lost that respect for our elders. And the more of an elder you become, the more you realize how much that's happened. And we don't, probably because, at least in part, our extended families have been, for many of us, scattered across the country. We don't sit at the feet of our grandparents anymore. And I was fortunate enough to grow up just 2 blocks away from one set of my grandparents. So I got to spend a lot of time there, although we've talked about some of the stories my grandfather told that maybe weren't all that helpful, like when he was in the cavalry after World War I and they were still riding some horses. allegedly, Geronimo hit him in the back of the head with a hatchet, and that's why he had a crease there, because he was bald, and I asked him, why do you have a crease there? And that was the story he came up with. So maybe not all the stories are that helpful, but they're helpful. He told me that he could, I forget which, I think it was this finger, was really soft. He was about 5'4", he was a short man, and he told me that was soft because he and his friends used to take sticks and a hatchet and play a game called chopping the heads off chickens. And then one day he had hit his finger with the hatchet, and that's why it was soft. Well, of course not, but as a kid I was like, really? But other grandparents, and my Nana certainly did impart wisdom, and my grandpa could too. And we've sort of lost that. And that's come home to me in a real way as I've read the coverage about what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri right now. And the other thing that's come home to me is an idea that Richard Rohr has about the first half of life and the second half of life. And he says the first half of life is where we build sort of our container in which we're going to live our life. We're concerned about what we're going to do. We want to get out of high school, maybe go to college or else start a career. We want to know what that career is going to be. Many of us are looking for a partner at that point, a life partner. We're looking for a place to live, and we're becoming established. And we're doing those things and setting up those things which we think will make us happy throughout our lives. And then at some point, and Richard Rohr says it's between 35 and 55 for most people, something goes wrong. We get fired. Somebody becomes seriously ill, or maybe even passes away. There's an accident. We get injured. We have a surgery. Could be almost anything. And we start to realize that there's more to life than that container we've constructed for the first 35, 45 years. And that the container really won't make us happy forever. And when that happens, we generally start to look at our spiritual life and look for answers there. And yet, in our culture, there are a whole lot of people in positions of leadership who seem to never have made that transition, who never get into the place, for example, where they start training somebody to one day replace them at whatever it is they do, because they're afraid that if I train Erin to replace me, she'll be better at what I do than I am, and pretty soon I'll be out the door. And that's maybe illegitimate. Well, and Erin, I don't want to say, I may not get in trouble here. She certainly would. But that's something to think about at a certain point in life. But we see people who are in their 70s and haven't even started to train someone to take their place. And that was brought home for me in a little short video clip that was running around Facebook, because Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton flew to Ferguson, Missouri, and some activists from the community confronted Jesse as he was pulling away from McDonald's in his car and said, "Why aren't you out here marching with us?" And Jesse said, "Well, I spent my day with the family." And they said to him, "Why aren't you getting people out of jail?" And I couldn't hear his mumbled answer. And what the activists were confronting him with was, at some point, you have to step aside and let other people do the work you've been doing, and then your role can transition into offering wisdom. You can be the mentor. You can pass along what it is you've learned. And if you don't, it doesn't get passed along. And every leader that follows you has to reinvent the wheel, learn those lessons all over. And so really, in an attempt to hang on to our legacy, we lose our legacy. It dies with us. Something similar has happened to the message of Jesus. Up until 313, in the edict, we talked about this yesterday in the retreat, the Edict of Constantine, Christianity was a persecuted religion. It was a religion of nonviolence. It was a religion where you didn't join the army. They thought it was wrong. And And I say that making absolutely no judgment on anyone in the military today, because after 313, when Christianity became the religion of the empire, well, now you went from being on the bottom of the heap to the top of the heap, so you did the things that you do when you're now cooperating with the government instead of running from it. And now it became okay to join the military. In fact, it became so okay, we saw 3 crusades and countless people murdered in the name of God, or killed in war in the name of God and murdered. It became okay, if I couldn't convert you, to just take you out. And that seed now started to look like quite a different plant altogether. And as I've watched things unfold in Ferguson, one of the biggest complaints of local religious leaders is that they seem to be more interested in pacifying people and taking credit for it from the local government than they are in really serving people and healing them and helping them move forward. And so it's almost as if the seed has sprouted at least 2 very different plants. And what's held up sometimes is that the Quakers and the Amish and the Mennonites have held on to that peaceful, nonviolent teaching of Jesus, and even in the Hebrew Bible, that teaching much better than the mainline traditions have. And at some point, people figure that out. And I think what's happening is the prophetic voice isn't coming out of that traditional spiritual perspective anymore. It's coming up out of the street. And when somebody says to a spiritual leader, you aren't helping us, that should be a cause for real concern. Now, of course, people ask people to help them in ways that are destructive all the time, and that's something you don't want to do. So I'm not saying it should automatically cause a shift, but it should at least cause people to step back and look. How do you love somebody? If that's the basic message. How do you love somebody while you're beating them over the head? That's awful hard. It's not impossible. One of the experiences I had that really brought this home for me was when I worked in inpatient mental health, and I had gone out to the Order of Julian of Norwich one morning. I worked second shift. In fact, I had gone the day before, and I stayed the night, and I stayed there, had a quiet day and a half, and then I left directly from there and went to work. And 30 minutes after I arrived at work, there was a violent confrontation I had to help, I almost said seduce, suppress. I'm not that good. But it was especially jarring because I had been silent for a day and a half before that. And yet, it was necessary to protect people to act in a way I probably otherwise wouldn't. So I don't want to suggest it's a real simple question. And I certainly don't want to appear to be sending a message that says, in 2014, it's inconsistent to be a spiritual person and be in the military. I think those plans have diverged. And I think it's an individual question. But what does bother me is that I see in American culture and in American spiritual and even American religious culture, and in what seems to be a growing idea that violence is the way to solve problems. While the same people point their fingers at who they would identify as Islamic fundamentalists and say, look how bad they are, they think violence is the way to solve their problems. It is certainly harder. It certainly takes longer. It certainly involves more setbacks to try and change things nonviolently. But I believe we've been presented with some graphic examples this last 10 days of what happens when we don't. When we see police officers on the street looking a lot more like the National Guard than the National Guard does. To the point when the National Guard gets called out, they say, we don't have any impact anymore because because there used to be this visual evidence that things were escalating and the level of intervention was escalating, but the police are actually bringing equipment that we don't even bring. There's a balance that's been lost. And I think it has to do with the fact that we're angry. And I think we're angry because we have some basic fundamental notions that just aren't accurate. That life should always be this way. And when it's not, rather than using our spiritual resources or developing spiritual resources to cope with that truth, that life isn't that way, we sort of stomp our feet and say, but it should be. It's that first noble truth of Buddhism. You know, life is unsatisfactory. And because I don't like the S word. And we can say life is unsatisfactory, so like a 2-year-old, I'll stomp my foot until it is. And we'll have about the same success that a 2-year-old does in changing their world when they stomp their foot. Or we can start to find a way to process that anger. Maybe that's the next great challenge for American spirituality in all its forms and where it works with people. How do we help people overcome that frustration? How do we help people to develop realistic expectations? How do we help people to move from the first half of life that says, I'm 20 and I'm invincible, to the second half of life that says, ow, that hurts. And not feel as if something has gone wrong because of the change. And start to see that the change is normal. And maybe if we can see that the change is normal in ourselves, we can start to see that change is normal everywhere. And instead of being afraid of it, where it's appropriate, we can actually facilitate it. We can actually say that the best response as a culture is not a violent response. But it's certainly okay to defend yourself and protect yourself and the ones you love. But that most of us will never have to do that. And then maybe we would see less of these incidents where somebody makes somebody mad because of the way they drive. And they have to get shot for it. Maybe we can move to a place where our streets become safe again. But if we remain in the first half, where we're all about accumulating and getting enough for me, and never about the second half, where we become more about, at the very least, sharing the ways to get what we need, we'll never make that transition. And things will just get worse and worse, and I'm afraid that will fuel the anger and the violence. And it's not a pretty picture. Amen.